For decades, fans believed Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison were inseparable. Wild twins of the 60s, two forces of nature who could have shaken the world with a single collaboration. But the truth was far darker, far more shocking. On the evening of September 13th, 1968, what seemed like a casual meeting at a Hidden Hills house turned into a night that would define a feud for the ages. Janis, curious and cautiously respectful, walked into that room expecting conversation, maybe a few songs, and perhaps even a spark of creative connection. What happened instead was a nightmare. Jim Morrison, intoxicated and relentless, crossed every boundary, cornering her outside and grabbing her hair with brutal force. In an instant, the admiration she had once felt evaporated into shock and rage. Janis reacts with instinct, swinging a bottle of Southern Comfort that shattered against Morrison's temple, leaving him stunned and bleeding on the dirt driveway. That single act of self-defense transforms the narrative between them. What should have been a story of potential collaboration became one of betrayal, humiliation, and an unshakable enmity. Even worse, Morrison immediately began twisting the story to his own advantage, painting Janis as hysterical and infatuated, sharing his version of events with anyone who would listen. That night did not just ignite a feud, it reveals a truth that the world rarely seen about both legends. If you want to uncover the full story behind the most shocking night in rock history, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where you are watching from. Can you imagine standing in Janis's shoes that night? It began on the night of August 23rd, 1970, exactly 48 days before Janis Joplin would leave this world. A night that did not feel like a concert at all. It felt like standing inside a thunderstorm wearing no armor, no shelter, just raw skin and a shaking heartbeat. Janis moved backstage with the force of a small tornado, wrapped inside a 5'5" body. Her hair was wild. Her bracelets clattered like warning bells. People always said her voice could punch through steel, but that night it was her silence that frightened them. She had just finished a performance that pushed past 110 decibels, louder than a roaring aircraft. Yet somehow she carried even more noise trapped inside her chest. And then the spark hit the powder. A man she trusted, a man from her own crew named Seth Morgan, let out a cruel remark. Not loud but sharp. Something about her drinking. Something about the ghost she had been dragging since childhood. The words cut her deeper than a broken bottle ever could. Janis spun around fast enough to make the whole room flinch. Her eyes flashed with the heat of gasoline catching fire. Every musician near her froze. Men who had played through bar fights and riots suddenly standing as still as statues. Janis reached for the nearest bottle of Southern Comfort, the one she carried the way others carried Lucky Charms. For one trembling second, no one knew if she would smash it, throw it, or scream into it. Because when Janis felt pain, it never whispered. It arrived like a freight train with no brakes. And in that trembling moment, everyone understood something terrifying. Janis was not fighting the man in front of her. She was fighting herself, and she was losing. Let us return to the place where everything began long before the world learned her name. A time when Janis was just a child, fragile and fierce in the same breath, standing at the edge of a life she did not yet understand. It was 1943 in Port Arthur, Texas, a town as orderly as a set of shelves in a general store, but hiding rules as tight and unyielding as chains. And there, in a small white house on 25th Street, Janis Lynn Joplin entered the world with a force no one could contain. Her father Seth worked in the oil refinery, counting every penny like it might escape. And her mother Dorothy kept the household in strict lines, hoping to mold a Southern lady. But Janis was never made to be molded. She moved to her own rhythm, a wild drumbeat that did not fit the quiet hum of Port Arthur. By the age of 10, she had already discovered blues singers like Lead Belly and Bessie Smith, voices that carried the weight of 100 sorrows and made her feel less alone. Other kids sang pop songs and cheered in school halls. She hummed the ache of voices older than her years. School was a battlefield. By 15, she was already the target of relentless cruelty. Boys called her ugly. Girls whispered that she was strange. Once the students held a cruel vote and named her the ugliest man in school. Man, not girl. The joke carved into her like a knife, a wound she would carry through stages and recording studios alike. Teachers complained she was too loud, too emotional, too unpolished. None understood that her loudness was survival. It was the only way to scream inside a town that tried to silence her. Yet even in the cruelty, she found sparks. Friends like Janie Barnett and Robbie Krieger in local circles saw her as a flame, not a misfit, a spark that flickered and threatened to burn everything in its path. By the time she was 18, she was already slipping away from Port Arthur, chasing the distant promise of a city that would hear her voice, feel her pain, and maybe, just maybe, give her a place to belong. Those early years carved her into the Janis the world would know, a woman with the roar of a hurricane and the fragility of glass, a soul who carried a lifetime of rejection in her chest yet refused to be broken. Every bruise, every laugh, every whispered insult became a note, a chord, a song waiting to explode. And in the quiet moments, when no one was looking, Janis was already fighting the town, fighting the labels, fighting herself. And that fight would shape everything that came next. By the year 1967, Janis Joplin had left Port Arthur far behind, chasing the promise of San Francisco, a city buzzing like a hive with music, rebellion, and neon dreams. She arrived with nothing but a suitcase, a worn guitar case, and a voice that could cut through steel. At 24, she had already performed in more than 50 clubs. From tiny basements where smoke hung in clouds thick enough to choke, to dusty auditoriums where the seats were old enough to remember the First War. Every night she poured herself into those songs, sweat dripping from her forehead, bracelets clattering like bells, warning of chaos. Then came Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, and everything changed. She stepped onto the stage with Big Brother and the holding company and belted out Summertime in a way that made the audience feel the heat of 1,000 suns. The festival drew more than 200,000 people, a crowd so massive it could have swallowed Port Arthur whole without even noticing. Cameras from every major television network trained on her, capturing every tremor of her voice, every twist of her hips, every tremble in her hands. And when the last note hung in the air, there was a moment of silence that felt heavier than lead. Then the crowd exploded, a roar so loud it registered over 120 decibels. Janis felt it like a shock wave running straight through her chest. For a brief moment, the world seemed to bend toward her, but the brilliance of the stage came with a shadow she could not shake. Backstage, the green rooms were nothing like the applause. They were filled with managers calculating every dollar, producers whispering how her body looked in the spotlight, and musicians counting who got more attention. By 1968, Janis was performing over 200 shows in a single year, sometimes two in a day, traveling between San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York like a ghost haunting the highways. Her voice tore through night after night, yet inside, she felt hollow, a vessel drained of everything except the need to scream. And that scream came from more than the songs. It came from the bruises Port Arthur had left on her soul. Every cheer, every sold-out hall, every standing ovation was a reminder that people loved her for the hurricane on stage. Not the girl who sometimes cried alone in cheap motels. Managers pushed pills to keep her awake, sedatives to help her sleep, and alcohol to calm the anxiety that never left. By the age of 25, Janis had already spent nearly $25,000 on substance after substance, enough money to buy a small house in Port Arthur, yet not a cent could buy the calm she craved. Her relationships became a blur of names and faces, musicians, journalists, fans. Some tried to protect her, like Chet Helms, the promoter who had first brought her to the Fillmore, but most treated her like a commodity, a force of nature to be packaged and sold. Lovers came and went like hurricanes, leaving debris in their wake. One night in late 1968, she kissed a man backstage after a show in Berkeley, only to find his attention already wandering toward another singer across the room. She laughed it off, a sound that was sharper than any knife. But inside, she felt the ache of rejection settle deeper than ever before. And yet, when Janis walked on stage, it was different. The lights, the amps, the audience, these were her allies. She could scream, cry, laugh, curse, and no one called her strange or fragile or too much. She could transform her entire body into the instrument, making every note a confession and every song a reckoning. But the applause never followed her into the hotel rooms, never stayed in the taxis racing down empty streets at 3 a.m. It was gone before she could breathe, leaving her in a silence that was more terrifying than any crowd had ever been. Her fame became both a crown and a cage. She was recognized on every corner of Haight-Ashbury, on every street of Los Angeles, and sometimes even on the buses carrying her from one gig to another. People wanted a piece of her, a memory, a story, or just a smile. By the end of 1968, her life was measured not in years, but in screaming crowds, shattered hotel windows, and hundreds of hotel keys thrown on floors she never remembered. Every hotel room she entered became a battlefield between who she was and who the world demanded she be. And in that battle, Janis learned a dangerous truth. The higher she rose, the farther she fell. Every scream, every cheer, every tear on a stage was borrowed from a deeper wound that no applause could heal. The fire of her music illuminated the night but burned her from the inside. The girl who once ran from Port Arthur was now trapped in a whirlwind of fame and expectation. And she was only 25, with the world at her feet and the ghosts of her childhood whispering behind every hotel door. It was the evening of September 13th, 1968, and Janis Joplin had no idea that a single night would change the way she saw the world forever. She had been told it would be a quiet gathering, a chance to talk, maybe share a song or two with other musicians who understood the fire inside her. She did not expect the storm waiting on the other side of the front door. Janis arrived at a Hidden Hills house, the kind of place musicians rented when they needed to disappear from Hollywood's spotlight. The sun was just dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the driveway, and everything felt calm. Morrison was there, leaning casually against a wooden post with a glass of wine that had barely been touched. At first, she smiled, teasing him lightly about behaving himself. Morrison smirked and promised he was saving the wild part for later. The first hour passed without incident. They talked about music, blues phrasing, the weight of their stage personas. It felt like the first time in months that Janis could breathe without someone telling her what to do or how to feel. But then the air shifted. Morrison moved from wine to bourbon, and the effect was immediate. His voice thickened. Sentences drifted into rambling provocations. His sensitivity vanished like smoke. He leaned closer, eyes burning, and suddenly the room felt smaller. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, closing in. Janis tried to deflect with humor, joking she needed fresh air. She stood and moved toward the sliding door. Morrison followed, every step deliberate, his presence like a wall blocking her exit. Outside, the evening air should have been a relief, but Morrison was already there, stumbling across the dirt driveway, calling her name in a mix of charm and entitlement. She opened the driver's door of her station wagon, gripping the wheel with both hands. And then it happened. He reached through the open window and grabbed a fistful of her hair, jerking her backward with such force her body twisted sideways. The sound she made was not fear. It was shock. Pure disbelief that someone she had once respected could turn into a predator in seconds. Janis reacted instantly. Her hand found the bottle of Southern Comfort resting beside her. She swung with precision, born from instinct, the glass smashing against Morrison's temple. He collapsed onto the dirt, blood mixing with spilled liquor and dust. The impact echoed like a gunshot in the silent hills. Janis slammed the door, started the engine, and drove away, leaving tire marks in the gravel, leaving behind the man who had rewritten trust into violence. The aftermath was worse than the attack itself. By the next morning, Morrison had already begun telling his version of events. He claimed she had lost control from excitement, that the swing of the bottle had been playful, a joke. The story twisted in the ears of musicians, producers, and anyone who would listen. Janis heard the distortions like blows to her chest. Men she barely knew told her she had overreacted. The truth, the raw terror and betrayal she felt, had been stolen and reshaped into entertainment. Every retelling painted her as hysterical, infatuated, or out of control. The Scene nightclub in New York later that year delivered the final blow. After a set at Fillmore East, she walked in with friends, only to hear Morrison loudly recounting the bottle incident to half-amused, half-confused listeners. He gestured, acted it out, laughed. When he noticed her standing there, he raised his drink and smirked. Janis froze, and then she turned silently and left. That moment cemented it. Morrison was not dangerous because of temper. He was dangerous because he believed he could rewrite reality, sculpt fear into desire, and turn trauma into spectacle. From that night forward, Janis did not just avoid him. She despised him. Every scheduled festival, every journalist's question about the doors, she gave polite nods or silence, wept them. She never hated easily. She forgave slights, dismissed insults, and laughed at rumors. But Morrison had crossed a boundary deeper than anger, deeper than violence. He had stolen her truth and performed it as theater, and that was a violation she could never forgive. Even when paths crossed at backstage festivals months later, she would not look at him for them. No apology, no conversation. The feud was sealed in one night, in one act, in one brutal misunderstanding turned monstrous. And in that, Janis realized a terrifying truth. Some men do not just harm with their hands, they harm with their stories, with the way they convince the world that the victim is the villain. And that lesson, carved in shock and fury, would follow her through every stage she ever walked. By the spring of 1969, Janis Joplin was no longer just a rising star. She was a phenomenon. Every city she entered, every club she performed in, felt like a storm of sound and heat. She was selling out hundreds of venues a year, from the Fillmore in San Francisco to the Avalon Ballroom, traveling thousands of miles with Big Brother and later Full Tilt Boogie Band. Her voice tore through the night with the force of a hurricane, yet behind the stage, the hurricane had no place to go. Janis's days began in hotel rooms that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. The walls were thin, the beds narrow, the city lights bright enough to keep her awake. By dawn, she was already on the phone with promoters, managers, and sound engineers, coordinating sets and rehearsals. Every night she would perform until her voice cracked, sometimes singing over 3 hours without a single pause, leaving her throat raw and her body trembling. The applause would roar, cameras would flash, and yet she would walk away feeling emptier than she had felt before stepping on stage. The pressures of fame were relentless. Managers pushed her to drink to keep performing, sedatives to fall asleep, and stimulants to keep awake. By the age of 25, she had consumed enough substances to fill dozens of small bottles, enough to buy a modest house in Port Arthur and still have money left over. But the money never soothed the ache inside her. It never quieted the ghost of every insult from her childhood. Every moment she had felt invisible. Every night she had cried alone in a motel room. Relationships became a blur. Lovers came and went like summer storms, leaving wreckage in their wake. Musicians tried to anchor her. Friends tried to hold her steady. But the currents of fame and addiction were stronger than any tether. Chet Helms and Bob Newworth, two people who had guided her early career, watched helplessly as she drifted further into chaos. They saw the smiles on stage and the tears off stage, the laughter that could light up a hall and the loneliness that could swallow a city. And yet Janis continued to perform, because the stage was the only place she felt truly herself. Lights, amps, and audiences were allies, not adversaries. She could scream, cry, curse, and laugh, bending her body into every note as if her very bones were part of the music. But the applause never followed her into hotel lobbies, never rode with her in the taxis at 3 a.m., never stayed in the silent rooms of her mind. It vanished the moment she stepped off stage, leaving her facing the quiet she feared more than any crowd. By late 1969, the cycle of performance and collapse was almost unbearable. She would perform a set at the Fillmore East, fly to Boston for another, then return to New York with only a few hours to rest. Her calendar was a maze of shows, press interviews, and recording sessions. In 1 month alone, she performed 22 times, traveling more than 15,000 miles, and yet the success did not lift her spirits. It felt like running on a treadmill that only got faster as she ran. The public saw the diva, the wild rock star, the woman with the hurricane voice. What they did not see were the nights she spent crying into a pillow, the mornings she woke with panic in her chest, or the moments she realized that no applause, no sold-out shows, no magazine cover could fill the empty space involved in her. Fame had given her everything and taken more. She had reached the pinnacle of success, yet she was trapped in a cage made of bright lights and broken promises. Even as she gained control over her music and her performances, Janis knew that the battles were no longer with managers, lovers, or audiences. The battles were with herself. The girl from Port Arthur, the child who had been called ugly and misfit, was still there, living inside a body that the world now revered. Every note she sang was both a declaration and a confession. Every scream was a release. Every song, a plea. The hurricane had grown into a tempest, but inside, the calm never returned. By the end of 1969, Janis was performing at the height of her power, yet her life outside the spotlight was fracturing. The thrill of the stage could not shield her from the weight of addiction, the solitude of the road, or the ghosts of her childhood. The higher she rose, the farther she fell. And for Janis Joplin, the storm had no end. Only endless nights of roaring applause, followed by silent despair. It was the early morning of October 4th, 1970. The world would never hear Janis Joplin's voice again. She was 27, the same age as so many legends before her had left the world. And yet it felt impossibly young. That night, she had just returned from a performance at the Boardwalk Hall in Atlantic City, a show that had brought together nearly 15,000 screaming fans, each one expecting to witness the hurricane herself. She had given them everything, her voice raw, her energy unfiltered, her soul exposed on every note. Janis walked into her hotel room, the lights still glowing faintly through the curtains. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, spilled whiskey, and the faint perfume of a woman trying to hold herself together. She had performed over 200 shows in the previous 12 months, traveling from San Francisco to New York, Los Angeles to Boston, covering more than 40,000 miles in airplanes, taxis, and vans that never seemed to stop moving. Her body was tired, yes, but her mind never rested. Every applause, every cheer, was a reminder that she was both adored and alone. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed, her legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Her friends, including Chet Helms, who had been with her since the early days in San Francisco, watched silently. They knew the pressure that weighed on her, the burden of expectation, and the battles she had fought for years. But nothing could have prepared them for what would come in the next few hours. Janis had always been a storm contained in a human body. Her highs were electric, explosive, like lightning striking open water. Her lows were equally violent, dark clouds rolling across the sky with no warning. That night, the storm had reached its peak. She took substances that she had long used to survive the chaos of life on the road. She had already fought battles with exhaustion, with heartbreak, with betrayal, with herself. But for reasons no one could fully understand, the storm inside her finally broke. The hours passed with a frightening quiet. By 7 a.m., Janis was found lifeless in her room. The world learned that her heart had stopped. But the truth was more complex than a simple failure of the body. She had consumed alcohol and heroin, a combination that would later be reported as lethal. Her voice, the instrument that had carved her name into history, was silent forever. The same voice that had screamed summertime to a sea of 200,000 at Monterey, that had ripped through 22 shows in a single month, would never rise again. The shockwaves were immediate. the music world mourned. Fans cried on sidewalks, in theaters, in small towns that had only heard her on the radio. Fellow musicians, like Grace Slick and Jimi Hendrix, spoke in hushed tones about the girl who had poured every ounce of herself into the stage, leaving nothing for herself. Her death was not just a headline, it was a warning, a tragedy, a mirror held up to the cost of genius under relentless pressure. Even after her death, her story continued to twist and turn. Some praised her for her wildness, her rebellion, her fearless scream. Others whispered about her addictions, her relationships, her temper. Yet the truth remained that Janis had lived with more intensity in 27 years than most people could imagine in 70. She had been a hurricane, a fire, a voice that shook the world and then vanished like smoke over the ocean. In the days that followed, journalists, biographers, and fans pieced together her life through the fragments left behind: diaries, letters, recordings, interviews. They counted hundreds of performances, calculated the thousands of miles she had traveled, and tallied the dozens of bottles and pills that marked her struggle. And yet, numbers could never capture the full force of Janis Joplin. They could not convey the way she had walked into a room and made it feel alive, or the way her laugh could fill a silent studio like sunlight through a cracked window. Her final night became legend, a cautionary tale and a tribute at the same time. Janis Joplin's life had burned faster than most, brighter than most, and left a scar on the music world that would never fade. She had screamed with all her power, loved with all her heart, and lived with all her fire. The world mourned, the music remembered, and her legacy, like her voice, remained untouchable, uncontainable, and unforgettable. The girl from Port Arthur, the misfit, the hurricane, was gone. But every note she ever sang, every scream she ever released, every raw, aching, beautiful song would continue to echo across stages, in headphones, and in the hearts of anyone willing to listen. The final night was silent, but the storm she carried would never die. As we look back on the life of Janis Joplin, it is impossible not to feel both awe and sorrow. She lived like a wildfire, burning bright and fast, leaving the world changed in ways that are still being felt today. The story of her childhood in Port Arthur, the battles with isolation, the struggles on the road, the nights of fame and collapse, and the tragic final hours all teach us something powerful about the human spirit. Janis was not perfect. She was messy, loud, wild, and at times reckless. But she was fiercely, unapologetically herself, and that is the core of the lesson her life leaves us. In a world that often tries to shape people into molds, Janis reminds us that authenticity carries a cost, but also a power that cannot be measured in numbers, applause, or charts. She endured decades of cruelty and rejection, yet transformed that pain into music that could reach the soul of anyone willing to listen. Every note she sang was a testament to her courage, every scream, a declaration of survival. We learn from her that being different is not a weakness. It is a strength. It is the spark that ignites creativity, passion, and connection. Her life also teaches us about the consequences of neglecting our inner selves. Fame, success, and admiration may feel like the ultimate goal, but without balance, without people and practices that nurture mental health and safety, even the brightest stars can burn out too soon. Janis' story reminds us to hold space for our emotions, to face our fears, and to reach out when life becomes overwhelming. The world may cheer for our achievements, but it cannot protect us from our own storms. That responsibility, as painful as it can be, belongs to each of us. Watching her journey, we also see the importance of boundaries and self-respect. Her encounters with Jim Morrison, the pressures from managers, the expectations of fans, all of it tested her limits. And though she could not always control the chaos around her, she fought fiercely for her dignity in moments when others tried to rewrite her story. That is a lesson that transcends music and fame. It is about standing firm, speaking truth to power, and refusing to allow anyone else to define who you are. Ultimately, Janis Joplin's life is a mirror. It reflects our struggles, our desires, our fears, and our potential. It shows that brilliance is rarely born without sacrifice, that creativity is entwined with vulnerability, And that authenticity will always be both a gift and a challenge. Her story is not just about tragedy or music, it is about the raw, relentless pursuit of self, the courage to scream when the world demands silence, and the beauty of living fully even when it comes at a high cost. So as we close this chapter on her life, take a moment to think about your own story. What fires are burning inside you? What truths are waiting to be expressed? Janis' life may have ended too soon, but her voice continues to speak to all of us who are willing to listen. And if there is one thing we can carry forward from her journey, it is that living boldly, loving fully, and embracing the storms within us is what makes life meaningful. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the extraordinary life of Janis Joplin, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you do not miss the untold stories from the music world that history tried to bury. We want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what part of Janis' story resonated with you the most. Remember Janis Joplin, Hurricane may have left the world quiet in her final hours, but her legacy continues to roar. And each of us in our own way can carry a little of that fire forward, 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 forward.